Picture this: the US Navy's next aircraft carrier doesn't float. It doesn't cut through ocean waves or anchor off coastlines. Instead, it lifts off, climbs into the sky, and operates from altitudes where traditional naval power has never existed. Not a replacement for the fleets we know, but something entirely different, a flying fortress that projects American power from the clouds themselves. Sound like science fiction? Here's what makes it real. This isn't a new idea someone dreamed up last week. Engineers have been chasing this exact vision for over a century, testing it, failing at it, learning from it, and now, with technology finally catching up to ambition, the concept is roaring back into serious development. The United States is actively pursuing what could become the world's first truly functional airborne aircraft carrier, and the implications are staggering. But before we launch into the sky, we need to understand what's already dominating the ocean. America's sea-based carrier fleet isn't just impressive, it's overwhelming. The numbers tell a story that's almost hard to believe. By most credible assessments, the United States controls approximately 25% of the world's aircraft carriers. That alone sounds significant. But here's where it gets really interesting. When you measure total flight deck space, the actual real estate available for aircraft operations, America has more than doubt. Well, what every other nation on Earth has combined. Not just more than all of them together. And we're not talking about quantity without quality. The newest generation, the Ford-class carriers, represents something beyond incremental improvement. These are vessels built around a completely different philosophy of naval warfare, starting with the USS Gerald R. Ford itself. Let's talk about power first, because everything else flows from it. The Gerald R. Ford runs on two Bechtel A-1B nuclear reactors, the most sophisticated propulsion system ever installed on a naval vessel. Nuclear power changes the entire operational equation because it removes the constant anxiety of fuel consumption. Conventional carriers are always burning fuel, always calculating range, always needing resupply. Nuclear carriers operate on a fundamentally different timeline. Here's what that means in practice. Across an expected 50-year service life, the Ford needs major refueling exactly once. One time. That translates to roughly 25-year operational stretches where the ship can move, fight, and project power without ever worrying about running dry. And when it moves fast, top speed around 30 knots, which translates to about 35 miles per hour. That might not sound like much compared to aircraft, but for a floating military installation displacing over 100,000 tons, it's breathtaking. Fast enough to reposition across oceans, fast enough to respond to crisis, fast enough to be exactly where it needs to be, whether that presence is welcomed by allies or deeply unwelcomed by adversaries. But raw speed and endurance are just the foundation. What makes the Ford class genuinely transformative is how it sees and thinks. Modern naval warfare isn't won by the toughest platform anymore. It's won by the platform that sees first, understands first, and acts first while the enemy is still trying to figure out what's happening. The Ford approaches this through integrated sensor architecture that older carriers simply cannot match. Instead of relying on multiple separate radar systems that have to talk to each other through translation layers, the Ford uses a more unified approach centered on the SPY-3 multifunction radar system. This is an active electronically scanned array ESA for short top rating across X-band and S-band frequencies. What does that actually mean? It means this radar can do multiple jobs simultaneously without the compromises that used to force designers to choose. It handles wide area surveillance, tracking aircraft hundreds of miles away. It manages air traffic control around the ship, making sure friendly aircraft don't accidentally become casualties of congestion. It contributes to missile defense by tracking incoming threats and coordinating countermeasures. And it does all of this at the same time, switching between tasks faster than any mechanical radar could dream of. Sensors aren't just eyes anymore. They're decision engines. They shape what commanders believe is real, what they think is possible, and ultimately what they choose to do. When your radar suite can track more targets, discriminate between threats more accurately, and feed that information into combat systems faster than your opponent, you're not just seeing better, you're operating in a different reality entirely. One where you have more time, more options, more control. And then there's the air wing, arguably the entire reason these massive ships exist in the first place. A carrier without aircraft is just expensive floating steel taking up ocean space. The air wing is what transforms metal and machinery into power projection. At any given time, the Ford can operate with up to 75 aircraft, a mix of manned fighters and increasingly sophisticated unmanned systems. But the crown jewel, the aircraft that represents the cutting edge of American naval aviation, is the F-35C Lightning II. The F-35C is a fifth-generation carrier-capable fighter tied to one of the most expensive weapons development programs in Pentagon history, commonly cited at around $400 billion. That price tag invites criticism, and plenty of it. But the promise behind that investment is straightforward. One aircraft that can handle almost every mission you throw at it. Air superiority? Check. Ground support? Check. Electronic warfare? Check. Operating from carriers in challenging sea conditions? That's literally what the C variant was designed for. It has treated as today's default frontline fighter across multiple service branches precisely because it was engineered for versatility at a scale previous generations couldn't touch. But here's the thing about the cutting edge: it doesn't stay cutting edge forever. The Navy is already looking beyond fifth-generation fighters toward whatever comes next, often discussed under the F-X program label. Sixth-generation capabilities, new propulsion concepts, different approaches to stealth, sensors, and weapons employment. And the Ford class was built knowing this was coming. The ship's systems are designed to be adaptable, to absorb new aircraft types without requiring complete reconstruction. When those next-generation fighters arrive, and they will, the Ford will be ready to host them, launch them, and recover them without the carrier itself becoming obsolete. This is one of those quiet ideas that doesn't get enough attention. Adaptability is a weapon. The future doesn't arrive as one perfect machine that solves everything. It arrives as a messy, unpredictable wave of upgrades, patches, new requirements, and edge cases that nobody saw coming. The platforms that survive aren't necessarily the most powerful when they're built. They're the ones designed to evolve, to absorb change, to remain relevant as the world shifts around them. That's what audiences instinctively respect about systems that feel future-proof. They reflect the same quality humans need in rapidly changing environments. Flexibility, the capacity to learn new tricks. And that's exactly why the airborne carrier concept is so seductive. Put all of this together and the pattern becomes clear. American carriers already set the global standard at sea, operating with capabilities no other nation can match. So it's natural, almost inevitable, that engineers and strategists would start asking, could we take this same concept, this same projection of power, this same ability to deploy and recover aircraft far from home base and move it into the sky? That question has sparked project after project, proposal after proposal, spanning decades of military thinking. But here's the real challenge, the part that turns dreams into systems or exposes them as fantasy: recovery. Launching things is easy. Relatively speaking, anyway. You can drop a drone from a cargo bay. You can fire a missile from a wing pylon. You can eject payloads with explosive charges if you're desperate enough. Gravity helps. Momentum helps. Launching is just organized falling with style. But getting it back, that's where everything gets brutally complicated. A flying carrier only becomes operationally relevant if it can repeatedly deploy assets, recover them safely in various conditions, and do it with reliability. That survives bad weather, electronic interference, mechanical failures, and the pure chaos of contested airspace. That's the part that separates fantasy from functional system. And that's why this topic resonates on a human level beyond the technical specs. In everyday life, anyone can start something. Anyone can launch a project, begin a relationship, open a business, start a sprint. The question that determines success isn't about the launch, it's about recovery. Can you come back? Can you reset, repair, adapt, and go again without losing the entire plan? Recovery is where the cost of ambition reveals itself. It's where good ideas meet reality and either prove themselves or collapse. The history of airborne carrier attempts is largely a history of recovery failures. Real-world versions won't look like Marvel's SHIELD helicarrier, that floating fortress bristling with fighters and Avengers. But the concepts humans have actually pursued over the past century represent the closest anyone has pushed toward making that fantasy real. And if we're reaching back 100 years, the story begins where many aviation stories do, with airships. Airships sound quaint now, almost comically outdated, like something from an alternate history where technology took a wrong turn. But in their era, they represented the original persistent platform. They could loiter over an area for hours or days. They could carry meaningful payloads. They could maintain presence in ways that fixed-wing aircraft simply couldn't match with the engine technology of the time. That is the same craving that drives every mothership concept since. Stay in the fight longer than your opponent can tolerate. Outlast them. Be present when they can't be. Force them to make decisions based on your persistent threat. The moment engineers tried attaching smaller aircraft to these airships, they discovered a problem that would repeat across every generation since: stability, control, and the absolutely unforgiving physics of connecting to moving objects in a moving atmosphere. It's not like docking two ships where you can throw lines, bump hulls, take your time. In the air, everything is in motion: the mothership, the parasite aircraft, and the medium itself. As far back as 1917, people were already testing the basics. Aircraft were literally suspended beneath airships, tiny fighters that could be released to provide a defensive screen protecting the airship from enemy aircraft. These weren't sophisticated weapons platforms, they were desperate attempts to solve the vulnerability problem that doomed so many airships in combat. Once airships faded from mainstream military use, victims of their own fragility and the rapid advancement of fixed-wing aviation, you might think the flying carrier concept would die with them. But it didn't. It evolved. Different proposals kept emerging through the decades, each one wrestling with the same core challenges. How do you launch aircraft from another aircraft? How do you control them once they're out there? And how do you get them back? One of the most famous later concepts emerged in the 1970s when the US Air Force seriously explored converting a giant cargo aircraft into an airborne carrier for parasite fighters. Not airship launched by planes from World War I. Modern jet-powered microfighters that could be released mid-flight and potentially recovered the same way. Two heavy lift candidates were analyzed for the mothership role: the Lockheed C-5 Galaxy and the Boeing 747. Both enormous aircraft by any standard, but each with different strengths and limitations. Boeing's pitch leaned hard into the 747's advantages. They argued it offered better range and endurance even when flying with enormous payload weights. We rate talking around 883,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight. That's not a typo. Nearly 900,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, weapons, crew, and cargo capable of flying intercontinental distances. The parasite fighter concept makes intuitive sense once you think about it strategically. You don't send your entire team into the danger zone. You send the fast specialist, the precision instrument designed for one job, then pull them back to a safer hub for refueling, rearming, maintenance. It is the airborne equivalent of a pit crew strategy. In racing, the support stays safe while the racer takes the risks. But intuitive doesn't mean easy. Think about what mid-air recovery actually requires in practice. You need to match speed between two aircraft, often with very different flight characteristics. One is massive, stable, designed for cargo. The other is small, agile, probably designed for combat maneuvering. You need to match altitude precisely, not approximately, precisely because a few feet of error can mean collision or complete miss. You need to stabilize relative motion in 3 dimensions while both aircraft are subject to turbulence, wind shear, atmospheric conditions that change second by second. It's like trying to dock 2 cars on a freeway, except the freeway is 3-dimensional, invisible, constantly changing, and the road itself is moving. That's why so many proposals look brilliant on paper and brutal in reality. The gap between theoretically possible and reliably executable in operational conditions is where dreams go to die. In Boeing's 747 concept, the aircraft was envisioned carrying up to 10 microfighters simultaneously. This wasn't a casual idea about stuffing a few tiny jets into empty cargo space and hoping for the best. The proposal involved purpose-built microfighters small enough to fit inside the modified 747's fuselage plus a sophisticated launch and recovery system that could carry them across intercontinental ranges, release them over the combat area, bring them back mid-air, and even refuel them if required. On paper, it solved multiple problems simultaneously. Range? The 747 has it in abundance. Payload capacity? More than sufficient. Operational flexibility? You could position the mothership outside enemy air defense ranges and send the microfighters in for specific missions. But once you get past the excitement of the concept, hard questions emerge fast. How much real combat capability would those microfighters have? They'd need to be small enough to fit inside the mothership, which means limited fuel, limited weapons, limited sensors. Could they actually survive against the advanced air defense systems and enemy fighters they'd be expected to face? And even if they could survive, could the recovery system work reliably enough to bet missions on? In the end, Boeing's 747 flying carrier concept never moved beyond conceptual studies and internal reports. Still, those reports left something valuable behind, a conclusion that even with major technical hurdles, the airborne carrier idea looked technically feasible. Just likely expensive and complicated. And expensive and complicated isn't just a footnote in military procurement, it's often the entire war. A system can be technically feasible, proven in controlled tests, validated by experts, and still fail completely because it's too difficult to train personnel on, too demanding to maintain in field conditions, too fragile when things go wrong. That's why the best military concepts often look boring on the surface. They're not the most ambitious ideas, they're the ones that scale. The ones that work when you have average crews on bad days and terrible weather. The airborne carrier dream keeps colliding with that invisible wall, sustainment. How many hours of maintenance are required per hour of flight? How many specialized crews do you need? How much training investment? And critically, how many failures or near failures occur before commanders stop trusting the system and refuse to bet missions on it? If your platform can't be trusted, it stops being a power projection tool and becomes a liability that ties up resources without delivering results. Then Lockheed entered the conversation and decided subtlety wasn't the answer. True to Lockheed's reputation for pushing boundaries until they scream, they imagined a flying aircraft carrier that was carrier-sized in the most literal sense possible. The CL-1201 concept was pitched at around 5,265 tons, roughly 11.6 million pounds, and tall enough to feel like a 14-story building floating in the sky. Not a cargo plane with a few fighters tucked inside. An actual flying fortress, a mobile airbase that never touches ground. To even pretend this thing could achieve flight, the design had to embrace extreme scale. We're talking about a wingspan around 1,120 feet and a fuselage roughly 560 feet long. For perspective, that is like lining up approximately 2.5 Boeing 747s nose to tail and then adding wings that stretch far beyond. The propulsion concept was equally audacious. The idea was that for massive turbofan engines running on conventional jet fuel, would handle the initial climb up to approximately 16,000 feet. That's the power-intensive phase, fighting against gravity to get this behemoth airborne. Then, once you've reached altitude, the system flips. Above 16,000 feet, an onboard nuclear reactor was proposed to take over, feeding the aircraft enough continuous energy to stay airborne for about 41 days straight. No refueling stops. No landing required. No brakes. Just sustained flight for over a month, operating as a persistent airborne base that fundamentally changes the meaning of power projection. And the performance claims didn't stop there. In theory, this aircraft could cruise around Mach 0.8 about 80% of the speed of sound while operating near 30,000 feet. Essentially living in the upper atmosphere like a flying city that never needs to come home. Concepts like the CL-1201 are compelling for reasons beyond their technical specs. They expose a fundamental truth about human engineering. We don't just build solutions, we build symbols. A flying base that stays airborne for weeks isn't merely a platform for deploying fighters. It's a statement about permanence, about presence, about the ability to project power continuously rather than episodically. But permanence creates its own nightmares. If something that massive experiences a critical failure, mechanical breakdown, human error, catastrophic weather, there's no quick pullover to the side of the road. There's no emergency landing strip that can handle it. And if it becomes a target in contested airspace, you're not risking just one aircraft. You're risking an entire ecosystem of personnel, machines, and mission-critical capabilities concentrated in a single vulnerable point. That's why these mega concepts often end up as legends rather than programs. The risk becomes too concentrated. You're putting too much value, too much capability, too many lives in one place. If it works, it's transformational. If it fails or gets destroyed, the loss is catastrophic on multiple levels. On paper, the CL-1201 reads like a flying city with military purposes. The design was envisioned with a crew of around 845 people, not a flight crew. A small town's worth of personnel plus the capability to deploy 22 multi-role fighters and even built-in hangar space, so aircraft could be serviced, repaired, and maintained without the mothership ever landing. But the downsides were obvious to anyone doing basic analysis. A machine of that scale would almost certainly consume billions of dollars in development and construction costs, plus ongoing maintenance demands that would require specialized facilities and supply chains. That's a significant reason it never progressed beyond the concept stage. Still, the CL-1201 hasn't disappeared from the conversation. Even today, it stands out as one of those magnificent, impossible designs that resurfaces whenever people start dreaming about airborne supercarriers. It represents the absolute ceiling of ambition, what you'd build if resources, physics, and risk were somehow not limiting factors. Now, if the CL-1201 was the giant fantasy that existed only on paper, the B-36 Peacemaker was the more grounded attempt that actually flew. The B-36 was a real strategic bomber, operational and deployed, that was seriously considered for flying carrier conversion. The idea was to pair it with the tiny McDonnell X F-85 Goblin, using the massive bomber as a mothership. In some proposals, the B-36 could theoretically carry up to 4 of these microfighters. The B-36 era highlights another pattern that repeats throughout military history. Technology doesn't just create new options, it actively destroys old advantages. A platform can be perfectly designed for its mission, absolutely dominant in its time, and still become functionally irrelevant the moment a breakthrough changes the fundamental rules. For audiences, that's a powerful observation that extends beyond military technology. It's not the strongest tool that wins forever. It's the tool that survives the next paradigm shift. That's true in defense procurement, and it's equally true in civilian life when new industries, new software platforms, or new economic realities suddenly erase what used to be an absolutely sure thing. In the 1950s, the B-36 looked like the perfect mothership candidate for one overwhelmingly simple reason. It was absolutely enormous. Its wings stretched approximately 230 feet tip-to-tip wide, enough to make even later heavy bombers look modest by comparison. That wingspan helped cement the B-36 into the short list of largest aircraft ever built to achieve sustained flight. At maximum load, you're talking roughly 410,000 pounds with full fuel, plus the capacity to carry as much as 86,000 pounds of weapons internally. It was a flying heavyweight built specifically for long-reach and massive payloads during an era when strategic bombing doctrine demanded the ability to strike deep into enemy territory, without fighter escort or forward bases. But here's the twist that shapes the entire B-36 story. For all that size and ambition, the aircraft never became the wartime hammer it was originally imagined to be. The B-36 was designed during World War II with scenarios in mind that assumed America might need to strike targets like Berlin from bases in North America. By the time the aircraft was truly operational and refined, World War II was over. The missions it was designed for no longer existed in the form planners had anticipated. But that monster size and exceptional range did spark a different idea inside the Air Force. If the B-36 could stay airborne for so long, cover such vast distances, why not treat it like a mobile airbase? Why not use it to carry smaller fighters into combat zones, release them for specific missions, then recover them and carry them home? That plan never really achieved operational success, and the reason is almost ironic given the effort invested. Aerial refueling technology started maturing rapidly around the same era. Once tanker aircraft could extend the effective range of almost any fighter by topping off fuel mid-flight. The B-36's biggest unique advantage, its extraordinary range stuff being a superpower that justified the complexity of parasite fighter operations. Aerial refueling is the quiet villain in many flying carrier stories. When you can refuel aircraft in flight using relatively straightforward boom or proband drogue systems, you don't need a massive mothership just to extend fighter range. The strategic problem shifts from how do we physically carry them there to how do we coordinate them effectively, and coordination is exactly where modern networks, data links, drone swarms, and increasing autonomy start changing the fundamental equation again. Fast forward past the mid-century experiments, past the Cold War proposals that never left the drawing board, and the United States circles back to the flying carrier concept in a more practical, technology-grounded form. Since 2015, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, famous for funding technologies that sound impossible until they suddenly aren't, has been exploring whether a modified Lockheed C-130 Recuel's cargo plane could function as a viable mothership. The concept centers on deploying and recovering Dynetics X-61 Gremlins unmanned aerial vehicles, essentially modern interpretations of the parasite fighter idea adapted for the drone age. The critical difference from historical attempts: these microfighters aren't meant to be disposable suicide drones that get expended on missions. The entire point of the Gremlins program is recovering. Launch them from a mothership position safely outside enemy air defense ranges, have them conduct missions inside contested areas, then bring them back using a specialized mid-air recovery system, essentially a drogue-style catcher paired with precise GPS-guided docking maneuvers to snag the UAV while both platforms remain in flight. The testing has been tied to Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, with International Air Response supplying a contracted C-130A aircraft specifically modified for the trials. And in January 2022, DARPA achieved a significant milestone. They successfully launched an X-61 Gremlins UAV directly from a C-130's cargo bay during flight. That might sound simple, just push a drone out the back, right? But it represents a crucial validation point. If the launch phase works reliably, repeatedly, under various conditions, then you've solved half the historical problem. You can actually deploy these systems operationally rather than just theoretically if the program clears its remaining technical hurdles and achieves consistent recovery success. It unlocks a genuinely significant tactical advantage. The US could release drone swarms from motherships operating in safe airspace, send those drones into high-risk environments to conduct intelligence, gathering electronic warfare, or strike missions. Then recover them back to the mothership's airspace for recapture, transport home, maintenance, and redeployment on the next mission. it's a fundamentally different operational model than disposable drones or traditionally deployed aircraft. You get persistence, reusability, and risk mitigation all at once. But the path hasn't been a smooth victory lap without setbacks. Even after proving the C-130 could successfully launch the Gremlins vehicle, subsequent tests encountered the exact problem that has haunted flying carrier concepts for a century: recovery failure. In one notable attempt, roughly 90 minutes into the test flight, a recovery procedure went wrong. A parachute system malfunctioned during the critical docking phase, and the UAV was lost. That's the kind of failure that kills programs if it happens repeatedly. But it's also the painful but useful kind of engineering problem, the sort you can isolate, analyze forensically, redesign around, and harden in follow-on iterations. You learn where the weak points are, where the assumptions broke down, what conditions caused the system to fail. If the Gremlins program continues moving forward successfully, solving the recovery reliability problem that ended so many previous attempts, it doesn't just validate one specific drone system. It establishes a template, a proven architecture that can be adapted for other mothership and parasite aircraft concepts. Different drones, different motherships, different mission sets, but the same fundamental operational approach. And that pushes the United States meaningfully closer to something that genuinely feels like an aircraft carrier in the sky. Not replacing the sea-based carriers that already dominate global naval power, but adding a new dimension on top of an already intimidating force structure. So here we are. Century after engineers first hung biplanes beneath airships, the dream persists and evolves. The challenges remain brutally difficult. Physics hasn't gotten more forgiving. Recovery is still the hardest problem, and complexity remains the enemy of operational success. But the technology has finally started catching up to the ambition. Current Carrier Forces Project. American power across oceans with unmatched capability. Flying carriers could project that same power from dimensions and positions traditional navies cannot reach, deploying from unexpected vectors, operating without coastlines or ports. Adapting to the drone age in ways that sea-based platforms simply cannot match. The future of power projection might not choose between sea and sky. It might demand both, integrated, overlapping, creating strategic options that adversaries cannot predict or counter through conventional means. How concerned should rival nations be about this development? What advantages does an airborne carrier provide that traditional approaches cannot match? And what vulnerabilities might these flying fortresses still carry despite all their capability? Those are questions worth thinking through carefully because the answers will shape how military power is projected for decades to come.